But that's likely who this was. Esther 1, 1 through 4 says, so let's dive in. Esther chapter 1, 1 through 4. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia over 127 provinces, that in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. There's some speculation that this feast was likely his preparation for his invasion into Greece. Right? He was going to invade Greece, and we know by archaeology and history that didn't go that well. Right? But there was hundreds of years of war between Greece and the Persians. So that's what this feast was related to. Bible archaeologists believe that King Ahasuerus was Xerxes I, who reigned from 486 to 465 BC, between the first and second phases of return of Israel to Jerusalem. It's about, just compared to the last lesson, this is about 60 years after the first return. Right? So 60 years have passed since last week's lesson. The exact dates of these events are uncertain. Now, I know this is maybe hard to see on this screen, but you can see this is the Ahasuerus we're talking about, Xerxes. And it's got some of the dates in here. So let's see. Darius, is mentioned in the book of Daniel. They've got some archaeological events posted here. Defeat at Marathon. So that's some of that war with Greece I was talking about. Let's see. So you can see Esther starts about here, near the beginning of Xerxes I's reign. And it extends till midway in Xerxes' reign. There's going to be additional returns, right? The first return to Israel happened off the screen that way, 60 years before. There's going to be additional returns to Israel from Persia by Ezra and then Nehemiah. So these are some of the other returns. The book of Esther gives us an example of how God works to protect people in the world. So the thesis I took from this for today's lesson is God's sovereignty is displayed through his works to providentially accomplish his will in the world. So Esther is a demonstration, an example for us of God's sovereignty, his work in the world. And we'll try and see that as we go through this lesson. So here's a question for you. For a book that demonstrates God's sovereignty or his providence, how many times, does anybody know how many times in this book is God's name mentioned? 0. It's not mentioned. I thought that was interesting. The absence of God's name is likely intentional. It's likely a literary device with the intention to reinforce the message that God is always working, even behind the scenes, to accomplish his will in the world, even though his presence may not be overtly seen. Esther is a good example for us today, even though it's in the Old Testament, right? Old Testament, don't have the Lord Christ, we don't have salvation, but it's a good example for us. Why would that be? The account demonstrates God's providence in a foreign land in Persia, his providence to his people in a foreign land in Persia, where God's servants are a minority. They're living in a secular world. They're surrounded by unbelievers. And all they have is God's written word. Now, there were some prophets that were there, but in this case, Esther, she's not talking to any prophets, right? Mordecai, her uncle, is not a prophet. Okay? So all she has is God's written word, just like us. In these ways, the setting of the book of Esther is very similar to the situation we face today. Right? We live as a foreign people in a foreign land. We're just traveling on, right? We're trying to get to heaven. We're pilgrims. We're surrounded by the unsaved. We have only God's written word, which is complete, so we don't have prophets. We live in a very secular world. In this book, we will see examples of God's providence in the midst of a sinful world, which is good for us because we want to know that God is working providentially for us. Okay, so my first point is God's providence is able to overcome the world to accomplish his will. 1a, God can overrule selfish decisions to accomplish his will. The book of Esther begins with an account of King Ahasuerus holding a banquet where he and Queen Vashti, where his queen Vashti refused to appear before the men at the feast. The king, in his anger at her refusal to come before them, resulted in her being removed as queen. So let's look at the passage. Esther 1:10 through 12 says, "On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman and Biztha and Harbona and Bigtha and Abigatha and Zethar and Carcas, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him." And as a result, we know, if you've read the story at all, Vashti was kicked out of being queen. It's unclear if she was executed or if she just was banished. It really doesn't tell us, but she is no longer queen. Now, here's my question for you. Remember, my point is God's providence is able to overcome the world, and my subpoint is he's able to overcome selfish decisions. So here's the question for you. What was motivating the king to call Vashti? What was his motivation? Okay, so pride. He wanted to brag. He wanted to show off his beautiful wife. Okay. What else? Authority. Okay. He wants to show his power, his authority. Okay, I'm with you there. What else?
He was drinking.
Okay, he's drinking. Yeah. So there's probably some lust here involved, right? He wants to oogle over her beauty. Anything else? How about selfishness? Right? There's some selfishness here. He's really not thinking of his wife. He's thinking of himself. Right? So you got all these motivations. Now, here's another question for you. So that's you got the selfish decision of the king to call Vashti. Now, what was the motivation for Queen Vashti to refuse the king's command? Why'd she say no? Okay, she wants respect. That makes sense, right? We're sympathetic to that. That's what all of us want. She wants respect. I'm with you. What else? Okay, if they're drunk, right, she is not going to want to go before them because it's going to be uncomfortable. Yeah, I agree with you. How about pride, right? She has some of her own pride. It's like, I'm not going to go debase myself in front of these drunken men that are there. I think there's probably a little bit of power play here. Like, you're telling me, your wife, that I have to do this. I'm telling you, as your wife, that I don't have to do this. Right? So there's probably some power.
You consider that pride to say I don't want to go and be with these drunken folks?
I think there's multiple things going on. I think there's some pride that, he is the king. He has given you a command. So I think there's some, it doesn't say that she was proud. I'm reading into it. That's my thinking.
think
We could agree to disagree on that one.
we also have to be kind of careful. We don't bring 21st century modern
Morals.
feminism mindset into Queen Vashti's
Reasoning?
reasoning. And again, we're like, well, she's an independent woman, and she's able to go out. In that culture, she wasn't.
Yeah, she knew the cultural constraints, right? She knew that by rejecting this command, she's rejecting the king's command. I mean, the king is the ultimate authority here. So I think there's some cultural
I
recognition.
think that's where you say the pride comes in. She knows the rules.
Yeah, exactly.
She decided not
I'm not going to do it.
to.
And there's probably good reasons, but
Maybe they had kind of a relationship where she felt comfortable to some degree with refuse things, but him being drunk, he's not on his best judgment.
maybe. Yeah, I mean, she is the first wife. You got to remember that in this culture, they have many wives, and they've got many secondary wives called concubines. So he's got a harem of women, and she's the first, right? So maybe they did have a good relationship, right? Maybe she felt like I could say no to him, but because he's drunk, he got mad.
I kind of wonder. She's so beautiful that she thinks that she can.
There's
get away
nobody
with
to compare.
it. Right? Like I can get away with this because I have some power.
Yeah.
Why do they call her concubines?
Concubines, it was the lower tier wives, right? So you had your first tier wives, and that would be like Vashti, and then you had these secondary wives. So there's a ranking because there's so many of them. There's this ranking in the harem, but they were all considered wives. Okay, here's my question for you. So if we go back to the point that God can overrule selfish decisions, did God direct the king and the queen to make these decisions? Did he direct the king to say, call her? Did he direct Vashti to say no? No, right? It's not like the prophet appeared or they had a dream. This is them making selfish decisions. And what we're going to see is God is going to use that to get Vashti out of the way and make an opening for Esther to come in.
So you don't think that her refusing wasn't a part of God's?
I do think it was part of God's work, but I don't think, so what we're seeing, you're going where I'm trying to go, which is God's providence was able to use these selfish decisions that these two individuals are making. He's able to overcome it with his providence to accomplish his purpose. If you were to ask the king or the queen, why did you make this decision? It would have been very much their own thinking. But God's going to use that to accomplish his purposes. So that's why I'm trying to say God is able to overcome selfish decisions to still accomplish his will. Although both the king and the queen's decisions were made based on their own selfishness, the decisions they made were used by God to bring about conditions that would bring Esther to the throne. Bit of application. God is able to overrule bad decisions. That's a good thing. We make bad decisions all the time. We want God to be able to overrule bad decisions with his providence. He's able to accomplish his will even when we make bad decisions. You know what? God knows the heart of people and the future choices they will make. That's why he's able to overrule the bad decisions. In John 2:24-25, Jesus said, but Jesus did not commit himself unto them because he knew all men, and he needed not that any should testify of man. Here's the key part. For he knew what was in man. You know, God can look into our hearts and say, I know what decisions you're going to make based on your personality. He knows our weaknesses, right? So, when he asked the disciples, hey, are you going to go with me to the cross? He knew what they thought they could, but he knew what their actual condition is. So he knows us better than we know ourselves. God knew that the heart conditions of the king and queen would lead to their separation. God knows the decisions we will make better than we do. After the king removed Vashti, he and the governing council came up with a plan. It was a plan to find a new queen, a new first queen. Not only does God's providence overrule selfish decisions, but God's providence is able to overrule bad plans. The plan they come up with is not a good plan. It's a bad plan. Esther 2:3-4 says, and let the king appoint officers. So this is the servants coming up with a plan. Let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, unto the custody of Hedge, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them, and let the maiden which pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. What aspects of this plan were bad?
Overreaching authority into family business.
Yes. Okay. I agree with you. It's overreaching authority. Because of the king's command, he's going to pull all of these women together. And guess what? Most likely this is not giving them an option. This is his people picking. That one's beautiful. That one's beautiful. Yeah, so this is definitely overreaching authority. Now, as Pastor mentioned, it's not an overreach of the king's authority in this culture, right? But remember, God said the purpose of government is for the good of the people. So this is a bad government overextending beyond what God intended for government to do because it's a dictatorship. So I agree with you. What else? Why else would this be a bad decision?
They're making judgment based on looks, not on character.
That's good. That's good. Yeah. If you think about it, what is the king's primary motivation here? It's actually mentioned in this verse right here, verse 4. What's his primary motivation? It's pleasure, right? This is not a decision based on character. This is a decision based on flesh. Please the flesh. Okay? Let's see. Let me see, what else do I got? Any other ideas on why this was a bad idea? Now, in this culture, it was acceptable to have many wives. Is that part of God's plan? Right? I mean, what do we decide how something is good or bad? Right? It's good if God says that it's good, and it's bad if God says that it's not good. So,
It's like Adam and Eve.
is it God's plan? You're right. It's based on the model that God gave to Adam and Eve. Is it God's plan for one guy to have 350 wives or however many wives? It's not. Jesus said that, right? From the beginning, it was intended one man and one woman. Why else? I can't believe it. I thought in this modern society, we would get some very feminist reasons why this is wrong.
Well, you don't know who these women are. They can be evil. They can be...
Well, that's from the king's perspective. Why is this a bad plan from a woman's perspective?
She doesn't get to choose.
Because the woman doesn't want to obey God.
There's no choice, right? There's no choice. How about this? Let's see. I think, to me, this implies the king gets to decide who he wants to marry, and the woman doesn't have a choice, right? So there's no choice. It implies that women are lower than men, which again, in this culture, that was the standard, but that's not right? Men and women are equal before God. He gives different responsibility to men and women in a marriage or in the church, but they're equal before God. So this plan is a bad plan, okay? The point is, God can use bad plans to still accomplish his will, to overcome the bad plan and exercise his providence. So application, God is able to overrule bad plans and policies to accomplish his purposes. Lamentations 3:37, who is he that saith, and it cometh to pass, when the Lord commandeth it not? You can come up with all the plans you want, say this is how it's going to be. And if God's not in on it, if God doesn't want it, your plans are going to be fruitless. God was able to overcome the king's selfish decisions and the bad plan to place Esther on the throne as king. He's going to use this. Okay, so finally, third thing. God can also use circumstances where people have no choice to accomplish his will. How many times in life do we run up on things where it is not what we want to do, right? But we have to do it. Pastor, how badly did you want to spend 4 months with your twins in the hospital?
Yeah,
Not at all. This happens to us all the time. There's circumstances that come up that we don't want to happen. Most likely, Mordecai and Esther had no choice in her selection as a young woman who would join the king's harem. Esther 2:8 says, "So it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace to the custody of Haggai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women." Now it's possible some women wanted to be part of the harem, right? Because it potentially would be an easy life, right? You've got everything taken care of for you. There's servants. Now you're part of a harem where there's many wives, so that wouldn't be great. But some of them may have wanted this. But there's things in this verse that make me think she did not want to do this. How was it that Esther came to the king's house, according to this passage?
She was brought there. She didn't come. She was brought.
She was brought there. Now you could ask, who was it that brought her there? But my impression, even if you look at this, when many maidens were gathered together, it doesn't say had gathered. It's not like the maidens were gathering on their own. This is somebody was getting them and gathering them. So these indicate to me this was not voluntary. This was, you're doing it and you're doing it.
Verse 3, when it says he appointed officers, that word is aptly chosen.
Yes. It also says, and the king's command went out, right? I mean, this is at the king's command. You know, God is able to work through situations where people have no choice. Although these situations may be bad, I think for Esther, and Mordecai, this is a bad situation. Even though the situation may be bad and contrary to our desires, God can still use them to direct his servants and accomplish his will. This makes me think of Acts 21:13 and 14. Speaking of Paul, where it says, "Then Paul answered, What mean you to weep and break mine heart?" Right? This is when he got the prophecy that he was going to be taken to Rome against his will. "For I am ready not to be bound only, but also to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." And when he would not be persuaded, we ceased. Say, the will of the Lord be done. You know, we're going to face things in life that we just do not want to do. And we have to do them because, it's a sinful world. I mean, bad things happen. But God can be involved in those things. God can overcome those things. He can work through those things. That's what Paul was saying. He's like, look, I don't want to go to Jerusalem and be arrested, but if it's God's will, I can do it. God will help me. In this introduction in the book of Esther, we have seen that God is able to overcome, through his providence, sinful decisions, bad plans, and bad circumstances. He can use all of those and still accomplish his will. Now, for the second part, what I'd like to do is I would like us to get this. Often accepting God's providence requires faith. Okay? Accepting God's providence requires faith. Here's a question for you. If God's providence is so active in the world, and that's what this lesson is showing us, God is actively involved in the world. If it's so active in the world, why are so many people skeptical that God exists?
Sometimes it doesn't appear like there's order. It feels very chaotic.
Okay? Looking at it, I would say from the world's perspective, things feel very chaotic. And maybe even from a Christian's perspective. Okay? I'm with you.
Willful blindness, because if they admit that there's a God that created, the God that organized, then there's a God who controls them.
Yeah, willful blindness. Yeah, you're right. It's like, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They don't want to see it. I was going to say something else, but I forgot what it was. If it comes back, I'll say it. Any other ideas?
They want to be able to do whatever they please.
Okay, there's some motivation there, right? They don't want there to be a God because they want to do what I want. I just said absence of faith, right? If there's no faith, you can't see it. A couple of subpoints. So the main
That hurts my heart. Faith is
so my main point is accepting God's providence requires faith. So here's the subpoint. God's providence is not always visible immediately. Okay, at the time when Esther was taken to the palace to face a forced marriage along with hundreds of other young women to an unbelieving dictator of a foreign nation, she could not have foreseen how God planned to use her to accomplish his will. In the moment, this looks very bad, right? You're having to leave your people. You're having to leave your adopted father whom you love. You're young. And you're forced to marry this guy that is, by all accounts, probably not a great guy. She had no way of knowing, no way of seeing how God's providence was going to happen. So in the moment, it would have been tempting to doubt, right? And I think that's often how it is for us. We face these difficult circumstances, and it's like, God, where is your providence in this? I don't see it. Well, it may be because the providence part that God's working is still way out here. You haven't gotten to it yet.
They had to change her name so they wouldn't know she was Jewish. And she must have felt like, I'm somebody different. They don't even want me. I have to give up my religion. I have to do
Yeah,
this.
a lot of reasons why she would not be comfortable. Give up her religion, change her name, not be with her friends and family anymore. Yeah. So I think in the moment, this would have been very, very stressful. It would have only been faith that would have held her to, hey, I know God has these promises for me, and I'm going to hold to these promises. We can see her concern in Esther 2:10-11. It says, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. I think both Esther and Mordecai were worried how Esther would be treated, especially if it was known that she was a Jew, right? There's a reason they're hiding this. It's not because of shame. They're afraid that she's going to be treated badly. So there's some concerns. The fact that Mordecai went every single day to check on her also shows that he has some concerns, right? So there's concerns here. Question for you. How long was Esther in the palace before she saw the king?
A year? Is that a year?
I mean, it says it here, right? Let's see. Maybe it's not yet. Maybe I haven't got to it yet. Let me go to verse 12. Let's go to verse 12 to answer that question. Now, you're right. When every maiden's turn, Esther 2:12. When every maiden's turn was come to go to the king Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of women, for so were the days of their purification accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for purifying of the women. So how long? 12 months, a year. So all I'm trying to get to with this speaks to, it was not immediate that she was able to see how God's providence was going to be using this, right? She had to go a long time before she knew what God was doing. This is just the time before she came before the king, right? Now then there's time beyond this when the whole thing with Haman happened, right? So it's much longer than a year. God's providence is often operating in a complex way over time that is not easily visible to us, right? God knows what's going on. He sees all these parts, and it's taken place over time that we don't see. Romans 11:33 says, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgment and his ways past finding out." That just means God's way more complex than we are, and he sees all these details. Not only may God's providences occur over a long time, God's providence allow for people's free will, right? God offers us free will. That's important, right? God loves free will so much that he lets people decide whether they want to accept him or deny him and go to hell without salvation. So free will is important. But God's providence is going to be inside of free will. So, at some point after Esther was made king, God allowed Mordecai to overhear a conspiracy to kill the king, which was reported to Esther, and she reported it to the king in Mordecai's name. Mordecai is the one who heard it. Esther 2:21-23 says, "In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains." Question, what's a chamberlain? What position is that? What does a chamberlain do? Is this a person in the government? I mean, what is a chamberlain?
Somebody that helps out in the living quarters.
Living quarters, yeah, you're on the right track. Essentially, these are the people that stood guard at the door, right? These were at the door to his bedroom. These guys are the ones that would answer when he said, "Hey, I want grapes," or something, right? These are the people that are right there serving next to it. The king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth, and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen. And Esther certified the king, therefore, in Mordecai's name. And when the inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. We know from the later chapters in Esther, specifically chapter 6, if you go read chapter 6, that it's this very account that was recorded in the records of the Persians that the king, when he couldn't sleep, got out and read, and then he wanted to bless Mordecai, and that's what ended up saving his life, so that Haman couldn't kill him. Now here's my question. So remember my point. God's providence allows for people's free will. So here's my question. Did God reveal Bigthan and Teresh's plan to Mordecai in a dream or in a prophecy? How was it that he found out this plan?
He heard it.
Okay, he heard it. There's no doubt that he heard it because he had to report it. So I'm with you. He heard it.
Right place, right time.
Right place, right time. God worked in the circumstances to allow Bigthan, Teresh, and Mordecai's own decisions, right? It was their own Bigthan and Teresh got together at a certain time in a certain place based on their own, logic and thinking, and Mordecai passing through somehow in his own time, in his own plan, his own free will, came together in such a way that Mordecai overheard their plans. If you think about it, what details did God likely have to work out to enable Mordecai to discover this plot? I mean, it sounds easy, right? We can see it in our minds happening in a TV show, right? It's like there's Mordecai sitting eating a sandwich, and there's Bigthan and Teresh talking behind the thing, and they hear it. But this is God working. Right? What would have God had to do to make this happen?
People be in the right place has to move people. He has to time people. It's
The
just
when,
so happens, never just so happens.
the when, the where, and the how have all got to be worked out by God behind the scenes, in the details, such that Mordecai, Bigthan, and Teresh were making their own decision, right? He's not imposing this on their free will. Later, God influenced the king's sleep, right? We see God influencing the king's sleep. His decision to read the records, the choice of the records, to include the account of Mordecai, and the timing of when he would promote Mordecai. Yet all of God's providential influence was done without impacting people's free choice to make their own decisions. Right? This goes back to that statement I made earlier that God knows exactly what choices we would make under what conditions. Right? He can see our hearts. Application. God works through the details in life to accomplish his providence. Because he does it while allowing people to make their own decisions, his providence often goes unobserved, especially by the world. Matthew 10:29-31 says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear ye not, therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows." Look, this is God just confirming what he's telling us in Esther. God's involved in the details. He's involved in the details. Another reason beyond time, so time is one reason people don't see it. Another reason is free will. But another reason beyond timing and free will is God's providence is that God's providence is difficult to understand is, the third reason, God's providence is working to accomplish complex purposes that can be difficult for people to grasp. So let me just read that again. That was a little complicated. God's providence is working to accomplish complex purposes that can be difficult for people to grasp. We don't have time today. We only have 5 minutes left. We don't have time today to review the entire story of Esther. It's a great, great account. I wish we had tons of time to just go through it. The book accounts how an evil man named Haman came to power and sought to destroy the Jews. God used Esther and Mordecai to turn his efforts of destruction into helping bring deliverance for the Jews. Not just Esther and Mordecai, but for all the Jews. So this is the account. Esther 8:5. I'm just going to read a couple of key verses here. Esther 8:5, Esther 8:11, and Esther 9:16. So verse 5 says, "And said, If it please the king, and if I have favor in his sight, and the things seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes," so this is Esther talking to the king, "let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's province." So she's asking the king to change the law. Verse 11, "Wherein the king granted the Jews," so this is what he changed it to, "wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, to cause to perish all the power of the people and province which could assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey." Esther 9:16. "But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives and had rest from their enemies and slew their foes 70 and 5,000, but they laid not their hands on the prey." So here's a question for you. Where would the bulk of the Jews' enemies be located? So let me just give you a little where my thinking is. Esther, Mordecai, and Ahasuerus are located in Shushan in Persia. Okay? Where are the majority of the Jews and the Jews' enemies?
Jerusalem?
They're in Israel, right? So here, think of this. You have God providentially working here in Shushan in Persia, and it's having an impact way over here in Israel, in Jerusalem. If you think back to our last lesson, right, the reason they were having so much trouble back in the Promised Land is because they were surrounded by heathen who were just constantly causing them troubles. This is going to give the Jews in Israel the freedom to defend themselves, to fight those guys, to kill those guys. Recall that when so I just said that. The Lord's providence in Mordecai and Esther's life had a direct impact on the people who lived approximately 900 miles away. So a bit of application. God's providence is working to accomplish multiple, complex aspects of his will. Although people may observe aspects of God's work in the world, right? So Mordecai and Esther, they could see, I can see now why all these things have happened. But they don't see all these, or maybe they did, all these implications across thousands of miles. Although people may observe aspects of God's work in the world, reliance on God's providence requires faith in God's promises. Hebrews 11:32 through 33 says, "And what shall I say more?" This is the faith chapter in the Bible. "For what should I say more? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Baruch and Samson and Jephthah and David also and Samuel and of the prophets who, through faith, subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions." Right? Esther and Mordecai had to operate under faith, not knowing that God's providence was going to work over time and over distance and over many complex factors to accomplish his will. God gives us the book of Esther as an example of the tapestry of God's providence in the world, which often goes unobserved to accomplish God's will. We can rest our faith in God's promises that he is working to accomplish his will in our lives and in the world. Let me just go out with this verse. 1 John 5, 4 through 5 says, "For whatsoever is born of God overcometh the world. And this is the victory that overcomes the world, even our faith. Who is he that overcomes the world, but he that believeth that Jesus is the Son of God?" God's telling us in that verse that Jesus, is the Son of God. That means he has the power to bring about his will in the world through providence. Often does it in the details, down in the details. All right, so that's all I've got. Thoughts? Okay, if not, let's close in prayer and then we'll be dismissed. Dear Lord, thank you for this lesson that demonstrates your providence, dear Lord. Even though it's in the Old Testament, it's a perfect example for us of how you work in this secular world to accomplish your will. Pray that you help us to have faith, even when we can't see all the intricacies of it. Help us to trust you, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. You're dismissed. Sure.